Hello, this is Darrell Castle with today's podcast. Today is Monday, June 30th, 2014. Today we're going to talk about war, specifically. The war that shaped the 20th century and in many ways still holds great influence on our world today. Current events happening every day today are in many ways affected by World War I. World War I was known as the Great War, at least until World War II came along. It began June 28, 1914, 100 years ago this past weekend. At least the act that triggered it began 100 years ago, when a young Serbian teenager named Gavrilo Princip assassinated the Archduke Ferdinand of Austria and his wife Sophie. He was a young nationalist, as I said. He sought a greater Serbia, as many people still seek today. The same thing still going on 100 years later, ethnic fighting across the world that we will talk about. When the Archduke of Austria was assassinated, Germany and Austria mobilized their armies. Well, Russia could not sit idly by with Germany mobilizing on its border, so Russia mobilized as well, which triggered Britain's mobilization, and France, fearing invasion, did the same thing. The 4.5 years that followed saw the war spread across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia, and it reshaped the modern world. Empires rose and fell. Kings and kaisers, as well as caliphs, were toppled from their thrones. Tanks and mechanized warfare were invented, as well as chemical weapons. The entire social structure of Europe was changed forever. The old caste system was ended. Millions of women entered the workforce, and the entire social structure was rewritten. Women were elected to the British House of Commons and received the legal right to vote. The world's map was redrawn, giving independence to countries such as Ukraine, Poland, the Baltic countries, and countries across the Middle East. Well, they were as independent as British colonies could be. The war was so destructive, killing and destroying the lives of tens of millions of people, that the psychology of war and its traumatic effects were studied for the first time. The United States took its first steps as a global power, having acquired its first colonies in its brief 1898 war with Spain. President Wilson was the first president, at least to my knowledge, to give voice to the term New World Order, which he hoped would be created out of World War I, though he failed in his bid for the League of Nations, and the New World Order had to wait until World War II to be formed. Germany was destroyed, an unimaginable defeat for the German people. Germany operated the first social welfare state in Europe, established by its leader Otto von Bismarck in 1871. The peace terms imposed on Germany after the war finished the country financially and gave voice to an Austrian corporal named Adolf Hitler, who had won the Iron Cross in battle in World War I. Unlike World War II, the German army was not dismantled after the war, but instead was left intact. Hitler remained in the army for a few years while he spoke across the country and gained a national following. 14 years after the war, he was elected Chancellor of Germany, an amazing rise to power for a mere corporal. There were serious questions about whether Britain even had to go to war, but nevertheless, Britain did, losing a whole generation of its most educated young men. In the first day of the Battle of the Somme, the British lost 20,000 dead, 40,000 wounded. 60% of its officers were dead. The French were invaded and forced to defend themselves or be conquered. World War I remains a monument to the folly and mindless slaughter and the stupidity of war in general. But a new world was created, as we talked about in the last two-part series, Lost Century. The Middle East, at least the part controlled by the old Ottoman Empire, became what is today Iran, Iraq, Syria, parts of the Mediterranean coast, Arabia, became Saudi Arabia. The countries of Eastern Europe were sovereign until they lost their sovereignty to Hitler and then to the Soviet Union. When the Berlin Wall came down in 1991, those countries thought that they would again be free as they were before World War I and shortly before World War II. Now, here we are 100 years later struggling with Russia over who controls Eastern Europe and with many others over who controls the Middle East. God forbid these countries should control themselves. There were questions to be decided after the unification of Germany in 1879, just as there are questions to be decided after German reunification during the fall of the Soviet Union. What role would Germany play in Europe? Would it control economically? Today is Germany's future an economic struggle with Russia for control of Europe. It sure looks that way. In Sarajevo, the Serbs built a monument to Gavrilo Principi, the teenager who killed the Archduke. They unveiled this monument on the anniversary of the act 100 years later. This tells you something about the ethnic hatred and conflict that have existed for 100 years. But those who control the maps, who draw the maps on pieces of paper and expect people to live by them, they will not let these ethnic conflicts be resolved, so they continue year after year. 100 years ago, before the start of the war, here we are again in 2014. Same song, second verse. At least that's the way I see it, folks. Until next time, this is Darrell Castle. Thanks for listening.